The Supreme Court has ruled that Louisiana will have to redraw its congressional map. Now, it's a landmark decision. It effectively guts, a major section of the Civil Rights era Voting Rights Act. It was a 6-3 decision along partisan lines that renders ineffective, really, Section 2 of the Act that's long been used to ensure minority voters are treated fairly in any redistricting. We're reacting to it. The former President Barack Obama criticising that decision, saying it shows how a majority of the current court seems intent on abandoning its vital role in ensuring equal participation in our democracy. Well, let's examine all of that further with you. Our International Affairs Editor, Kethevane Gorjestani, is with me here on set. Kethevane, just explain, first of all, what this decision is, how on earth the Supreme Court came to it.
Well, look, the question at the heart of the Supreme Court's ruling in this case was how much lawmakers, in this case in Louisiana, should or can consider race when they are redrawing electoral districts. And really, this case has been 6 years in the making. You have to go back to 2020, which was the last major census. At the time, Louisiana did some redistricting, and there was just one Black majority district in a state where Black voters represent a third of the state's population. At the time, a group of Black voters sued the state and won because they claimed that their votes were simply being diluted by only having one Black majority district. A new map was drawn, adding a second Black majority district. That's the one that we're talking about in this decision. There was at the time a new lawsuit, this time brought by a group that presented itself as a group of non-African American voters, claiming that a second Black majority district was basically unfair to them because it was diluting the voting rights of non-African Americans. A judge in Louisiana ruled that they were right, and the Supreme Court upheld this ruling, this new map, saying that it relied too heavily on race. The opinion of the conservative justices on the Supreme Court is that Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act that you were mentioning should be limited to intentional discrimination, not simply to districts that are drawn and that, as a result of the drawing, show a little bit of discrimination. So they raised the bar to proving that there was an intentional discrimination. The White House called it a complete and total victory, saying the color of one's skin should not dictate which congressional district you belong in. You mentioned the former president, Barack Obama. He said that this decision allowed legislatures to systematically dilute and weaken voting power of racial minorities, so long as they do it under the guise of partisanship rather than explicit racial bias.
Yeah, critics call it a gutting of the Voting Rights Act. How does the ruling then actually change the law now?
Look, this law that was signed in 1965, the goal there was coming out of the Jim Crow era. The idea was we have to open the ballot box to minorities, especially to African-American voters. And the idea was to try to do as much as possible to reduce discrimination in access to the ballot box. And Section 2 specifically of that law prohibits voting practices, voting procedures that could discriminate on the basis of race, of color, and even of a language group. Experts, legal experts in the U.S., believe that around 70 districts of the 435 districts in the House are protected by Section 2. And what this does is that it removes one more layer, because if you go back to about 13 years ago, in 2013, there was already a ruling by the Supreme Court that started chipping away at that Voting Rights Act. At the time, it gutted the requirement for states with a history of discrimination, especially in the South where there was segregation, like in Louisiana. They had to get approval before making an electoral procedural changes. That was gutted in 2013. Now you're adding some hurdles, trying to prove that there was intentional discrimination. All of this brought together means that there are fewer guardrails to this idea that you can, by redistricting, either combine minorities in one group or dilute them in all of the districts.
Let's look at the wider picture then. Of course, the big elephant in the room, if you like, is those midterm elections. They're coming up very quickly. Could it make any difference to them?
Look, it could. First of all, we have early voting in Louisiana that has already begun for the primary. The primary is set for May 16, but early voting is beginning on Saturday. And now the Washington Post is reporting that the governor of Louisiana might suspend the beginning of this early voting process in order to allow for the redrawing of the map. He might announce this by the end of this week. Donald Trump was asked yesterday what he thought of that. Should Republicans in these states try to redraw their maps before the midterms? He said, I would. That gave the indication to some of those Republicans to maybe try to do it. It could encourage some Republican-led states to try to redraw some of these electoral maps. And this, of course, comes into this larger, broader, countrywide gerrymandering battle between the Democrats and the Republicans that we've talked about on the set many, many times, where everybody's trying to gain one seat here, two seats there. The fact is that legal experts are saying that maybe this decision is a little too close to the 2026 midterms to make a really meaningful impact. Maybe in Louisiana it's going to change one seat, but it unlikely will change the ultimate result of the midterms. However, those same experts are pointing to 2028 as potentially where we could see the biggest changes, because I was telling you about those districts that were protected by Section 2. There's an estimate now that at least a dozen Democratic-led districts with majority Black or majority Latino voters could be targeted by Republicans after this decision by the Supreme Court, and therefore 12 seats, that could make a huge difference when you see that these days control of the House really usually comes down to a handful of seats.
Kethevane, thanks very much. Kethevane Gorjestani, our international affairs editor there.